The night shift at the Briarcliff Hotel wasn't exactly what I had imagined when I accepted the job. The pay was decent, and the hotel, a historic building in downtown Providence, had its charm, even if it was a bit worn down. During the day, it felt like a refuge for tourists and business people. But in the silent hours of the night, something about it changed. Shadows stretched across the hallways in an almost supernatural way, and the sound of the wind rattling against the windows created an unsettling echo that kept me on edge. On my first day, I was informed about certain peculiarities of the night shift. Mitchell, the manager, pulled me aside after giving me the basics. "Look, you just need to follow a few simple rules," he said, his voice always low, as if he were sharing a dangerous secret. I thought he was being dramatic, but what he said next made me question the sanity of this place. He handed me a crumpled piece of paper with 3 instructions. I stared at the words, trying to absorb their seriousness. First rule, never look directly into the eyes of the guests in room 313. Second rule, don't answer the internal phone line after midnight. Third rule, ignore any sounds you hear in the hallways. Stay at the front desk, no matter what. At the time, I laughed. I thought it was some sort of prank to scare the new employee, a bizarre tradition for rookies. But Mitchell didn't smile. His face was a mask of concern. "I'm serious, Daniel. You don't want to know what happens when these rules are broken." I should have paid more attention to the tone of his voice in that moment. Over time, the routine began to settle in. The first few weeks were calm, almost monotonous. The hotel was practically deserted after 11 p.m., except for a few guests rushing through the lobby, lost in their own thoughts. During those nights, I started to feel a constant sense of unease. Something in the air felt heavy, as if the building were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. Room 3113, in particular, soon became an obsession. It was an ordinary room, like any other, but the notion that I shouldn't look at the guests there stirred my curiosity. In the rare moments someone passed by, I forced myself to look away, even though I couldn't shake the urge to understand why. It was on one particularly quiet night that my curiosity began to take over. The shift was nearing its end, and I hadn't seen anyone in the lobby for hours. I was bored, and that strange rule about room 313 gnawed at me more and more. So I decided to break the first rule. I knew I shouldn't, but when I heard the elevator ding and saw a guest stepping out, dragging a small suitcase behind him, my instinct kicked in. I looked at him, but this time, I didn't look away. The man seemed normal at first glance. Tall, wearing a worn dark suit, he walked slowly, almost shuffling his feet. But there was something profoundly wrong about him. His eyes, something in them froze me in place. They weren't the eyes of a human being. They were empty, deep, as if filled with shadows. When he crossed the lobby, I felt a chill run down my spine. His eyes, even when they briefly met mine, felt like they were piercing through my soul. As soon as he exited through the front door, something in the atmosphere shifted. The air became heavy, as if an invisible presence were there, watching me closely. It was as though the hotel were alive, sensing what I had just done. That night, I couldn't sleep. The man's face haunted me, becoming clearer in my mind, his dark eyes appearing every time I closed mine. I started having nightmares where those eyes multiplied, surrounding me, watching from every corner, getting closer and closer. When I returned to work the next night, the atmosphere felt more oppressive than ever. There wasn't much activity, just a few people wandering through the lobby. Room 313 remained a constant in my thoughts, like a lingering presence. Every time the elevator went up or down, my heart raced, anticipating seeing that man again, or worse, feeling the weight of those eyes upon me. But the night stayed silent until the phone rang. I knew it was late. Far too late. I glanced at the clock. 12:32 a.m. The internal line. My heart raced in my chest. I wasn't supposed to answer, but the shrill sound of the phone seemed to mock me. Each ring a reminder of the rules I was already beginning to break. I held the receiver for a few seconds, my mind a chaotic mix of fear and curiosity. The ringing continued, persistent. With trembling hands, I finally answered. "Hello?" On the other end, there was no one, just a slow, dragging breath. I heard my name, whispered so softly that I could hardly believe it. "Daniel." The voice was smooth, yet deeply disturbing. It whispered my name repeatedly, as if calling me from some distant, dark place. I slammed the phone down, sweat trickling down my forehead. What was that? That night, I left the hotel feeling a constant presence at my back. On the walk home, the wind seemed to whisper my name, just like the voice on the phone. I felt my footsteps quicken. Behind me, the empty streets, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, followed. When I lay down in bed, the voice still echoed in my mind, and all I could think was, I broke the rule. In the nights that followed, something began to change in the hotel. It felt darker, as if the lights no longer illuminated the space the same way. The hallways, once merely silent, now seemed to murmur strange sounds, like soft footsteps that never fully approached, or muffled laughter coming from somewhere distant. I knew I was stepping into dangerous territory. The next night began like any other, but the feeling of normalcy dissipated as soon as I stepped through the doors of the Briarcliff. Something in the air was wrong. The hotel, with its empty, silent corridors, felt alive. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the old wood held some kind of repressed energy, ready to be unleashed. I ascended to the front desk, trying to ignore the sensation of being watched. But the echo of my footsteps sounded louder, heavier, reverberating through the hallways. Mitchell was nowhere in sight, and in a way, that was a relief. I didn't want to see that tired look on his face again, as if he knew something I didn't, something he preferred to keep secret. I sat at the front desk, opening the guest log to distract myself, but my thoughts kept drifting back to room 313 and the whispered voice on the phone from the night before. What was there? Why did those rules exist? And more importantly, why was I so obsessed with breaking them? For hours, everything remained quiet. The corridors were empty, the phone silent. I knew I should feel relieved, but the stillness only amplified the tension in the air. As the clock approached midnight, I began to hear sounds again. This time, they were clearer. Slow, dragging footsteps echoed through the corridors above me. I was hit by a wave of déjà vu, as if the events of the previous night were repeating themselves. The footsteps drew closer, but in an irregular manner, as if whoever was walking was stumbling, struggling to stay upright. My heart raced. But this time, it wouldn't be like before. I wouldn't answer the phone if it rang. I wouldn't look into the eyes of any guest. I would follow the rules, because now I knew they were not just superstitions or jokes. There was something very wrong with that hotel, and the rules were the only thing that might protect me. The footsteps stopped. I looked toward the elevator, waiting for the doors to open, but the elevator remained at the ground floor, the lights indicating it was still there. This made no sense. The footsteps had come from above. My breath caught in my throat when I heard the sound of a doorknob creaking as it turned. The door to room 313. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't help it. I stood up from my chair and slowly approached the corridor that led to the elevator. My whole body trembled. Each step I took felt wrong, as if I were moving away from any possibility of safety. But at the same time, something was pushing me forward. When I reached the end of the corridor, I saw the door to room 313 ajar. My instincts screamed for me to turn back, but curiosity was stronger. There was no sound coming from the room, just a suffocating silence that seemed to absorb everything around. The light from the corridor didn't penetrate the room properly, as if the darkness were solid, impenetrable. I took a step closer, just a glance. I wouldn't need to enter. That's what I kept telling myself. But deep down, I knew I had already crossed a dangerous line. I approached the door, my hand outstretched and trembling, and gently pushed it open further. The room was different from all the others in the hotel. Unlike the others, which had simple furniture worn by time, room 313 seemed like a capsule in time. Dark mahogany furniture, heavy and opulent, filled the space. Thick curtains were drawn shut, blocking any outside light, and the air inside was dense, thick with a bittersweet smell, like flowers left to decay. The room felt empty, but something deeply unsettled me. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. And then I saw him. Sitting in the armchair by the window, facing away from me, was a man. His body was still, leaning forward, hands resting on the arms of the chair. I couldn't see his face, but something about his silence, his presence, filled me with profound terror. It was the same man from the previous night, the same one I had looked into the eyes of. I wanted to recoil, to get out of there as quickly as possible, but my feet were rooted to the ground. The air around me felt like it weighed tons, and every breath was a struggle. Then slowly, the man began to rise. He moved with an unbearable slowness, as if breaking free from an invisible prison. When he finally stood, he didn't turn around immediately. I stood there, paralyzed, waiting for something horrible to happen, but he simply remained silent, standing with his back to me. When he finally started to turn his face, I shut my eyes, unable to bear the thought of seeing those eyes again. My instincts took over, and I bolted from the room, not caring about the noise I made, not looking back. The corridor seemed longer than I remembered, but I ran without stopping until I reached the reception. The elevator had never felt so slow, the doors taking forever to close as I pressed the button repeatedly. Back at the reception, my hands trembled so much that I could barely open the drawer where we kept the safety manual. I needed to find something, anything that would make me feel safe. But when the drawer opened, all I found were old documents, yellowed papers that made no sense to me. I looked at the clock. It was 12:33. The phone rang. I knew I shouldn't answer. I knew it would only make things worse. But the sound was deafening, each ring louder and more insistent than the last. The feeling of being watched returned with full force, as if there were eyes in every direction, closing in on me. I needed to make it stop. With a trembling hand, I answered the phone. "Hello?" My voice barely came out, a mix of fear and desperation. The line was silent, but it wasn't the same silence as before. There was something on the other end, something waiting. Then, the breathing began. Deep, irregular, as if it were struggling to escape. And then the voice. "Daniel." My name was whispered, drawn out, as if the person on the other end was too close. My stomach churned. The voice sounded familiar, but not in a good way. It was as if it came from somewhere I was trying to forget. "You broke the rules, Daniel." The phone fell from my hand, the sound of the line still buzzing in the air. My whole body trembled, and the air felt like it was escaping my lungs. I wanted to run, to get out of there as quickly as possible, but my legs wouldn't respond. Something was wrong with the hotel. I knew that now. Something far worse than I could imagine. The sounds in the corridors returned, but this time, they were closer. They were not just footsteps. They were muffled laughter, whispers that made no sense. Words mingled in voices that seemed to come from all directions at once. The air grew cold, and I felt the presence behind me before I even turned around. I was not alone. I closed my eyes, hoping everything would disappear, but the feeling that someone or something was watching me did not diminish. I could feel its breath on my neck, the chill of its presence. I knew I had crossed a line. The rules were not merely warnings. They were the only thing that kept the hotel under control. After that night, I began to realize that something inside me had changed. Just like the hotel, everything felt more intense, more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was constantly watching me, even in moments when I was surrounded by people. However, it was at the hotel that this presence manifested most clearly. Returning to Briarcliff filled me with an increasing dread. Each step toward the building was a challenge. On the way, my mind tried to find rational explanations, answers that would push away the feelings of dread and paranoia growing inside me. But each night, as I crossed those doors, I felt as if I were being slowly swallowed by the hotel itself. The rules I had broken now seemed less like superstition and more like a pact I should have respected. I had touched something beyond my understanding, and now there was no turning back. Room 313. The guest with vacant eyes, the voice on the phone. All these elements were interlinked in a way I still didn't comprehend, but I knew I needed to find out. I decided to investigate. There was no other way. Remaining without answers was consuming me, making my sanity slip through the cracks of each lonely midnight. I started with the history of the hotel. Providence was an old city, full of dusty secrets, and the Briarcliff was an important part of its story. The hotel had been opened in the early 20th century, built on land that, according to rumors, already had a dark past even before the first foundations were laid. They said that before the hotel, there had been an old house, shrouded in mysteries and inexplicable disappearances. When the house was demolished, the land remained vacant for years until the Briarcliff was erected. I searched through city records, spending hours in old archives and yellowed newspapers. The more I read about the place, the more I realized it had a kind of attraction for sinister events. There were reports of guests disappearing, employees who were last seen entering the hotel and never returned. Small mysterious accidents followed by silenced whispers, often covered up by financial settlements between the hotel owners and the affected families. It all seemed to have been skillfully swept under the rug over the years. I also learned something even more disturbing. The Briarcliff was known among some of the old residents of Providence as a place without echo, a location where, even if screams were heard, no one would respond. A building where sounds were lost, voices were muffled, and secrets remained buried forever. This explained why, on the quietest nights, I had the strange feeling that if I screamed, no one would hear me. In one of my searches, I discovered a name that frequently appeared in the reports of disappearances. James Harper. He had been a receptionist at the Briarcliff like me, over 20 years ago. Harper disappeared without a trace, and no body was ever found. The case was hushed up, considered just another unsolved mystery, but I knew there was more to that story. After all, I was already feeling firsthand what it was like to work there, and I knew that if I didn't do something, I would end up like Harper. With each shift, the atmosphere of the hotel felt denser, as if the building itself was aware of my search. My dreams were filled with endless corridors, doors leading to impossible places, And that voice, always the same voice whispering my name, calling me from within the walls. I would wake up in a cold sweat, feeling as if I were not alone in the room. It was on one of those nights, after a frustrating search for Harper's whereabouts, that something truly changed. The clock at the reception marked 2 a.m. The hotel was empty, except for 1 or 2 guests I had barely seen throughout the night. Everything was quiet until I heard footsteps in the corridor again. This time, they were different, more firm, more present. The sound wasn't coming from an undefined direction, like on other nights. It was coming straight for me, my eyes fixated on the corridor in front of me, and that's when I saw it. The elevator was slowly descending, the lights indicating it was coming from the 3rd floor. The 3rd floor, the floor of room 313. My hands grew clammy, and my heart raced so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. When the elevator doors opened, I froze for a moment, but to my surprise, the elevator was empty. Then I saw it, scratched into the control panel of the elevator, as if someone had clawed at it with their nails, was a name. Harper. I took a step back, but before I could process what I was seeing, the phone at the reception rang. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself, but when I opened them, the name was still there. I picked up the phone with trembling hands. Hello? The line was dead, just the distant sound of static. Then, a faint laugh, almost imperceptible. I quickly dropped the receiver, and the sound of that laughter lingered for a few seconds, echoing in my mind even after the phone was hung up. I knew this wasn't a nightmare. Something real was happening here. The name in the elevator, the disappearances, the voices, everything was connected, and I was at the center of it. That night, I couldn't leave. I stayed at the hotel until the sun began to light the streets outside. The daylight brought no relief. It merely reminded me that soon it would be night again and I would have to return. But before leaving, I went to the 3rd floor. The corridors there were darker than I remembered, the lights flickering occasionally. As I approached room 313, I noticed something new. The door was ajar. My whole body protested against the idea of getting closer, but I needed to know what was inside, what was calling me. Cautiously, I pushed the door open. The room was dusty, as if no one had entered there for decades. The curtains were closed, but a dim light filtered through a crack. The smell was the same as the last time I was there, that bittersweet odor of wilted flowers. However, this time, the room was empty. No guest, no sound, just silence. My attention was drawn to a detail on the floor. Footprints in the dust, as if someone had walked there recently. But there were no other signs of life, just the footprints leading from the door to the window and disappearing. I stood there for a few moments, trying to understand what all of that meant. It was as if the room had been waiting for me, as if it knew I would return. And then I saw something that made me freeze completely. On the wall, in large, dirty letters that looked like rust or blood, was written, "Harper, they are all here." My heart raced. The name I had been researching, the name I had found in the elevator, was now marked on the wall like a signature. But the last part of the phrase was what terrified me the most. They are all here. What did that mean? Who were they? I knew I needed to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. Terror consumed my body as I stared at the wall, trying to find a rational explanation. But deep down, I knew the truth. The hotel was alive. It held the secrets of those who had disappeared. Harper, the former staff, and perhaps many others. They were all there, in some way, trapped within the walls, within that room. I tried to run, but something held me back. Not physically, but mentally. As if the hotel had its own will, its own strength, and was keeping me in place. I left the room and hurried down the stairs to the reception, not daring to look back. My last night at Briarcliff began with a weight in the air. Something different from all the nights before. The clock struck 11 p.m. when I crossed the hotel doors for the last time. There were no farewells, no warnings. Just a silent feeling that everything would culminate there. That night, somehow. I knew I wouldn't leave the same, if I left at all. Everything seemed the same, but it wasn't. The atmosphere was dense, oppressive, as if the hotel itself was preparing for something. My thoughts were muddled, fragmented, each detail pulling me in different directions. What was happening to me? Was the hotel consuming me? Or was my own mind deteriorating? The footsteps in room 313, Harper's name in the elevator, the sounds in the hallways, all these elements spun in my head like an endless cycle. I no longer knew what was real. The lines between what I lived and what the hotel was showing me were blurring. I went up to the reception, but I could barely focus on the work. The small tasks I used to perform, organizing records, answering calls, checking in guests, felt distant, irrelevant. My body was present, but my mind wandered to places I couldn't control. At midnight, the hotel seemed quieter than usual. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. That repetitive noise began to feel unbearable, each tick reverberating in my head as if something was about to explode. Then, the phone rang. I knew I shouldn't answer it. I had broken that rule before, and the consequences had been clear. But this time, the sound of the phone was sharper, more urgent. It felt like a summons, an ultimatum. My hand went to the receiver, hesitant but inevitable. I answered. "Daniel," the voice whispered. There was no more static, just the same voice, soft but now closer, as if speaking directly into my ear. I closed my eyes, hoping it would end, but the voice continued, each word penetrating my mind. "You have to stop searching. They're already here." The phone dropped from my hand, the sound of the deadline buzzing in my ears. My eyes scanned the reception, searching for an answer, any sign. But everything around me felt the same. The same hotel, the same silence. Except it wasn't the same. I knew something had changed, that the end was near. Suddenly, a movement caught my attention in the corner of my vision. Someone was standing in the hallway. For a moment I thought it was a guest, perhaps the occupant of room 313. But when I turned to see more clearly, my heart froze. It was Harper. He was standing there, watching me. His face was pale, empty, as if life had been drained from him. He didn't look like a man who had disappeared, but like someone who should never have returned. He didn't move, but his gaze was like an anchor, holding me in place. I felt the weight of his stare as if the entire hotel was collapsing on me. "You shouldn't be here," I murmured, my voice faltering, but he didn't respond. Instead, he began to walk slowly toward me. His steps were soft, but each movement echoed in the walls. When he was close enough for me to feel his presence, he stopped. His gaze pierced mine, and it was then that I saw what he truly was. His face was disfigured. Deep scars and marks cut across his skin as if he had been tortured repeatedly. "You need to leave," he said, his voice breaking. I took a step forward, but halted. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what was happening. Harper raised his eyes and looked at me, and that was when I realized what he really was. "The hotel, it keeps us here. There's no escape. Have been here for so long, and now it's your turn." Terror washed over me. It wasn't just what he was saying, but what he meant. The Briarcliff was not just a hotel with strange rules. It was a prison, a trap, and I was trapped in it. I tried to run, to go back down the corridor, but the elevator doors were closed. There was no way out. The walls seemed to close in around me, the whispers in the hallways intensified, and the presence I had once felt from a distance was now right behind me. I no longer knew what was real. Whether Harper was truly there, or if she was just a manifestation of my own crumbling mind. Everything blended together. The voices, the sounds, the images. And then I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I would never leave Briarcliff. I was merely the next one. Over time, the hotel would consume me, just as it had consumed Harper, just as it had with all the others who had disappeared. I would become part of the cycle, a presence in the shadows, a voice in the hallways, calling for the next one. The clock at the reception struck 3 a.m. I was back in the lobby, but I couldn't remember how I got there. Everything was calm, as if nothing had happened. But I knew that I was now part of that place. The phone rang again, and this time I didn't hesitate to answer.